When I was a boy, I spent the summers with my parents in Alberta. It was pretty much the same as previous summers in the border regions of Saskatchewan. It was a bit cooler with a few more mosquitoes, but the tawny prairie grass, towering grain elevators, and endless wheat fields were classic signs of the Central Plains. The old house we had moved to was partially collapsed, with only 3 of the 6 rooms providing shelter from the wind and rain that blew across the balding prairie. The roof had completely fell in on 2 of the rooms, and there was some kind of dead animal in one that gave me the willies. We had no electricity or running water, but the well was close by with sweet water that was so cold it would make your teeth hurt. We had a wash bowl that we all used before eating. Being a 10-year-old among all adults, I was last in the pecking order to wash my hands. By the time it was my turn, the soapy scum floating on the brown water made me wonder if my hands were cleaner after I washed or before. Kerosene lamps were used to light the house at night, and my father warned me about how quickly the old gray wood of the house would burn if it ever started. He told me stories of houses being consumed before the family could wake and get out. I developed a handsome respect for those kerosene lamps that grew into a fear of them, so much so that I often awoke from fiery, smoke-filled dreams and struggled to get back to sleep. In our 3rd week there, it was mid-July, and due to drought, we needed grain for our horses. This is when we met the Brown brothers. They were known as hermits who rarely went to town. When we drove through their snowbreaks, I saw the biggest red barn that I had ever seen. It must have been a mile high and painted such a brilliant red that you couldn't look at it all at once. From behind it came a giant case 4x4 tractor with 8 monster tires and a cab big enough to host a poker game. As it rolled to a stop before us, a frail black man awkwardly fiddled the door open and slowly climbed to the ground as if every movement was causing him pain. Upon reaching the ground, he spit in his left hand and extinguished the cigarette he was smoking. He then wiped his hand on the oil-blackened jeans he wore. He approached and extended his right hand so quickly that it startled me, as my father grabbed it with a firm shake. This man was not black at all. Actually, he was quite pale when I could see through the shade of his hat bill. As dirty as he was, there was almost a glow about him. However, his skin and clothing was covered in dirt and oil. Perhaps it was his smile beaming like a headlamp, or his eyes that sparkled like Christmas. He said that his name was Eddie, and that we should go to the house to meet his brother Albert. We all walked towards an old shack, no bigger than a single-car garage. From the outside, it looked like it had a couple of small rooms at the most. This was confirmed when we entered to find Albert sitting at a small breakfast table with a cup of coffee. Albert looked to be about 80, a few years Eddie's senior, and wore no expression at all. His eyebrows were low, and his eyes were yellow and tired. I had seen this look only at a funeral and had hoped never to see it again. Albert was polite enough, and I felt sorry that he seemed so broke down. I grew to respect the brothers in their simple ways. They each had 2 sets of clothing. One they would hang on the clothesline when it rained and wore the other. It was as if they were 2 halves of the same person. Eddie would excitedly tell a story, and Albert would wearily chime in with the year, the dates, and how deep the snow was. The townspeople called the old hermits roast beef, and me too. They said that on occasion, the brothers would come to town and eat at the restaurant. Eddie would always order roast beef, And Albert would say, "Me too." Within the first few months, Eddie had taught me to snare a gopher with a spoonful of oats and some baler twine. He taught me that a man had to put his cigarette out in his hand so he could feel that the spark was completely gone to avoid causing a prairie fire. They owned many sections of land all connected to the house place. Eddie told me that they had homesteaded the house place and all the other land was acquired over the years. He would say, if a man has to cross another man's land to get to more of his own, he's got too much land and no damn right to it. Eddie worked hundreds of acres of land every day while Albert listened to Paul Harvey on the radio. I asked Eddie if Albert was as sick as he made out to be. He told me that Albert had died when their mother passed, but he was so stubborn that his body just hadn't caught up yet. I had worked my father's fields with an old Ford tractor that seemed like a garden tool compared to that big old case. When I would leave my parents at the end of summer and return to Missouri, all I could think of was running that giant tractor through the black Missouri dirt. When Christmas came a few years later, we got word that Albert had froze to death in his sleep. It was strange to me that a man could get cold enough to freeze in his own bed. Eddie had told me stories about the winters that would get so cold that your fingers wouldn't work. They even had a wire running from the house to the barn so you could find your way through the blizzards without getting lost. I suppose a hard climate makes a hard man. Still, it was difficult to imagine living in an uninsulated house at 50 degrees below zero, no matter how many stories I heard. I knew the cold would never get Eddie. Nothing could get Eddie. Even being snowed in for weeks with no food, he would still wear his smile and have that sparkle in his eyes. Anxiously waiting for June to roll around, I turned and planted the ground with my father, who had returned to Missouri in the spring. The days warmed as the time grew near to load the dogs and horses for the 3-day journey back to Alberta. Finally, we made our annual pilgrimage to Esther. As soon as we arrived and got the animals settled in, I saddled my horse and rode towards the Brown brothers' place. Along the way, I saw cattle along the road with the Brown brothers BB brand on them. I said out loud, "Eddie's sure going to flip when I tell him about the cows being out." As I passed the pastures and saw the fields, I noticed nothing had been planted or summer fallowed. In fact, weeds and briars had begun to take over sections of the greening field. When I rode through the snow breaks of the house place, I saw that the case had 2 flat tires on her right side. She leaned as if she were about to collapse under her own weight. I jumped from the saddle and ran to the house, nearly knocking the door off the hinges. Breathlessly, I told Eddie about the cattle. Eddie grumbled, "Quiet, boy. Can't you see I am listening to Paul?" Then he said something about the cattle not hurting anything. His eyebrows looked heavy and his body weak. When I asked him about the case, he said simply, "We aren't planting this year." Anger welled in my throat, and I spun and stomped out. As I jumped off the steps, I saw the poor case again. I turned back to the house and yelled, "To hell with you, you old bastard!" Then I jumped on my horse with my tear-filled eyes and ran it home as fast as I could. When I calmed down, I was too ashamed to go back and apologize right away. Within 2 weeks, I had built up the courage to return, not knowing that I would never see Eddie alive again. Sunday was my day off, so I had planned to saddle up old Rusty and ride down to Eddie's to say I was sorry. As I cinched the girth, my mother came out and told me that Eddie had died. I couldn't believe it. After all those hard winters, Eddie died on a warm Saturday in June. I told my parents what I had done, and their faces were quick to show their disapproval. No one mentioned Eddie again until the funeral. It was at the funeral, which consisted of no family and very few friends, that I remembered the yellow color in his eyes. It was then that I realized that Eddie had died at Christmas with Albert. After the funeral, I went to the bathroom to take a good long look at my eyes. There was no yellow. I was relieved at my findings, but at the same time, I sort of wish I had a little. I never thought I would forgive myself for what I said to Eddie, and I never thought I would forgive Eddie for dying on me. Sometimes life just ain't fair.